Alrighty, chummers. I have got a totally new preem project that I have been working on this whole past week and a while. It is called Storm the Matrix, and it is basically my take on Shadowrun. And Shadowrun, like, people absolutely love the lore, love the concept of it, but it is just every single time the game gets a release and gets its own edition, it just has some like horrible flaw with it. So there's like a million different fan game versions of Shadowrun, and this is my sort of take on it. Except lore wise, I am instead taking my brother's setting, the End of Empires, Veilguard, what I'm using for Storm the Castle, and then I'm just pushing that like 1,000-ish years into the future, where mega corporations are like in control of everything, and people are now running around with cyber augmentations. But there's also still magic, and there's wizards running around casting fireballs too. And I started working on this because I've been reading up on Powered by the Apocalypse, Fate, the Cipher system. All these games that sort of label themselves as like fiction first games. And I like have just become totally entranced with these games. I'm like totally fascinated by them. I like I just like love them from a game perspective. And I don't know if I particularly care for the label of like fiction first because so okay, the idea is in like D&D you ask to do a roll. I want to roll perception, and then the DGM narrates what you see from your perception check. In this like fiction first game, ostensibly in these games you as a character narrate what you want to do. I want to walk up to the desk and search through for papers, and then the GM tells you to roll. So like the mechanics are dictated by the narrative. But I feel like that's not really untrue of like D&D or other games. Like I feel like in D&D, like all the time my players say the narrative thing that they want to do, and then I tell them the mechanics afterwards. That being said, that's just a little sticking point I got about the like label of the game itself. But all the other actual, or just in that one little facet, but every other like part of the game, I like am just absolutely in love with it. Uh, so Storm the Castle. When I've been working on that, I got like pretty heavily deep into the crunch because I basically start off by taking D&D 5e because you know everyone knows D&D. That's like the easiest thing for people to get into. Most people are already familiar with it, so it was a like obvious choice. And I like tried to take D&D and fix every single problem I could find with the mechanical parts. Like I didn't like how resting worked, or if you know exhaustion or the fighter, and every single little thing that I thought could be changed a little bit to be made more fun or more interesting or more exciting. I changed like every single little aspect of it. But ultimately, D&D is a game based and built around combat. When it was originally, it was a war game. It was like a hack for a war game to like introduce role play mechanics into games about armies and just focusing on a single character in that army. But so much of that like core beginning has still stuck with D&D all the way to where it is today. And you still have this like hyper focus on battles and combat and every single rule between every single interaction with the different power levels and what it means for every different aspect of a person and their equipment and their abilities and every situation, and like tracking hit points and all that stuff. It's all like stuck with D&D, whereas like even in these newest versions that I feel like have more so gotten that interest in the story, role play, narrative elements of the game, and have been trying to push in more of that like here and there. But is still like 90% just still in its roots as that war game. Whereas these Fate, Powered by the Apocalypse, all that, it feels like they've been built entirely from like the ground up, just from the idea of like a role playing game, but not trying to stick to that like D&D core, like trying to do something totally different than that. Whereas like every other RPG that has come out for like 40 years since like D&D existed have all just been like different specific versions of D&D. And at least I'm making a lot of like generalizations here, but that's like true for a vast majority of the RPGs that are out there. But yeah, so like these games are not particularly concerned with the intricacies of combat at all. And I find, at least reading through the different reviews and how people compare the two, that's what I found to be like the giant major differentiation between D&D and all these other games. And like in D&D, in a 3-hour session, you might have an hour and a half that's dedicated to like 2 minutes of in fiction, in universe time of fighting, because you've broken it up into a bunch of like 6-second chunks, and you're going around the table for everyone for every 6 seconds, and you're just making it into this, you're like effectively just playing a game of like Hero Quest in the middle of this like storytelling game you're playing. Whereas in these generic systems, they like a 2-minute action scene might take 5, maybe 10 minutes to resolve mechanically. It is all done just through a couple of checks and a couple of results and a bit of narration, and that's the entire scene. And like looking back on D&D, the fact that every single other obstacle is handled in that way with just a couple of rolls and then some narration. If you're climbing over a wall, hiking through a forest, or going through a wizard's tower for clues, or trying to talk and do diplomacy with a noble, every single one of those scenes takes about how long, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 2-3 times longer than they would if you were like watching a movie or a TV show equivalent. And then you have this combat where like if you were ever watching a movie and 2 minutes of like action was somehow stretched into an hour and a half, that would be like crazy. That, like, I'm sure there is probably ways that has been done and has been interesting, but it's just like totally out of proportion compared to every single other scene in the game. But yeah, these generic games, the other thing is that like combat should be the most exciting, should be the most hype. It should be like what you've been sitting through the dull scenes for, to like pump some life back into the story. And I find in D&D just the complete opposite happens every single time. Like combat is when people decide to tune out, because like it makes sense, because all these other people are gonna have to take their turn, and it's gonna be 5 minutes before you get to go again. And so you've got time to just sit there and wait and think, and just like the energy feels so incredibly low in D&D when there's like combat, which should be when people are at their absolute hypest. But also, people can't keep up hype for an hour and a half. Like, there's no realistic expectation you could have for people keeping the energy up through an entire combat. Unlike the generic systems, where action scenes are actually allowed to be hype and exciting because they're always just going to be resolved in just a couple of rolls. They're always just going to take like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, about as long as an action scene in a movie would take to get resolved. Yeah. Okay. The other thing. So, Storm the Castle, or D&D in general, it's really tough to get new players in. Especially, I've decided to basically take D&D and then make it more complicated. And now my players who all have some amount of experience with D&D to some extent are like, I feel like they mostly got it, but there are still some elements I think that I've added that haven't been fully explored. But if I tried to take someone new, someone who has never played a role-playing game, and then just threw them into my Storm the Castle D&D game, it would be impossible for them to like break through and figure out what in God's name is happening, because there's a million different terms and a million different numbers and just so much stuff going on and so many ways that you have to think about like combat, and how there's this second game you're playing in the middle of this like storytelling game, which again is just this is coming from someone who truly does love war games. Like, I enjoy going out of my way to play Warhammer and playing games where we move little minis on the map and they all have different numbers. Like, I love that. I have a feeling maybe like 75% of my players probably are not the kind to go out of their way to just like play tabletop war games. It's almost like if we were just playing categories and then in the middle of the game, or after we tied on the first round or something, we then decided that we needed to have a 15 round tournament of tic-tac-toe of a mini game to like figure out the results of our one categories games. It's just like, from a game design perspective, the idea of just cramming this totally separate different game into the middle of your other game seems like an interesting idea, but I feel like can be done, like, I don't think it's for the best ultimately. But anyway, like, the game is going to be so simple in that there's not going to be a bunch of different qualities for weapons and movement rates, and there's not even going to be like armor classes, or it's just going to be totally detached from what you would regularly think from like D&D. It's just like, there's a combat, you make a roll. If you did well, the combat generally goes well for you. If not, it's just not going well for you. Which, like, again, for the amount of time that is spent in a D&D combat to, like, for the results, like, the results are almost always like way less meaningful than stuff that you spend doing diplomacy and negotiation and actual role play for, because like usually the consequence is just that there is a risk that you might get hurt from combat, so you like generally kind of want to try to avoid them. But once you're inside, 99% of the time you're just going to heal back, and it's going to be as though this never even happened, and we just spent, or it like accomplishes about as much as any other like scene that you could do, where you could convince someone to go and do something. You might like move someone's character forward one step in their plot, and we've spent an hour and a half doing that instead of like the 5 minutes that we could for a scene. Oh yeah, another question or another possible concern that brings up or raises is, well, okay, so if we have this 3 hour session, and in D&D, hour and a half of that is spent doing role play, and then there's like an hour and a half in the middle that's like a combat. If you just chopped that combat out and made it 5 minutes long, now you just lost an hour and a half's worth of content. Like, what do you fill that with? And the answer is just have a second mission afterwards. Like, you can basically just have 2 episodes in a row that you can play through, because now each episode only takes an hour and a half, which in D&D is something I've tried so incredibly hard to always make sure that each one session is one full story to some extent, is one full episode's worth of like plot happenings. And more often than not, it ends up having to get turned into multiple sessions to figure out this, usually turns into like a two-parter, if you will. And the idea of like getting in multiple adventures is like almost unheard of, at least from my perspective of a D&D player. And yeah, just thinking that like we could have like 2 beats happen per session, just like 2 like plot developments. That just sounds extremely appealing to me. That I feel like it just will make the entire pace of the campaign feel so much faster than the D&D campaigns normally do, where they have this tendency to feel like they are moving at like a glacially slow pace, even though like I feel like I try to do everything within my power to try to like rush like and just keep things moving, and both plot wise, like grand narratively, and on a small scale. And it feels like the design of the game is trying to act against you from really having that constant moving forwardness. But yeah, new player, I feel like they can just hop in. I feel like they can this is a lot closer to literally just talking through the plot of an episode of a TV series and just occasionally consulting the dice to see what happens next. So it seems like a thing that'd be a lot easier to just pick up, and you wouldn't need to have a lot of experience. You don't need to sit down and read 100 pages of a book to like have any sort of idea as to like if you're playing your character right or if you're just wasting a bunch of stuff. I will say this does kind of also raise the question of like, where is the line between us playing a game and D&D being a game, and then this just becoming an improv exercise? Which, fair enough, that is like a possible concern. I do think you want some game mechanics and some game elements in there. But generally, I do get the sense that like the thing that keeps people coming back to the table is not how we spent an hour dealing with 7 goblins and a minotaur, but with what the consequences of that are, and why we went out and did that, and what we need to do next, and figuring out what's going on with the story and making my next step towards my character. I think the wanting to find out what happens next is very so much more of like an appealing factor that makes people want to continue to play rather than the rolling a million dice and adding a bunch of modifiers and damage and whatever. Another thing that I think might be appealing for newer players is, at least for this setting specifically as opposed to Fantasyland, which really has very little to do with the system, but the idea that people can use modern language, You don't have to talk like a Shakespearean doth thou knight or something, which has this kind of like, it either makes the game pick up a comedic tone in that you're automatically being subversive by everyone or any number of people talking using modern language in this like fantasy land where they really should be using old-timey language, or you have to do the Tolkien, well, these are the words that I'm using to explain it to you so that you can understand by having it written in English, but really they're saying it in their own ways and they would really be hearing it in the way that they would be saying it. And this is just sort of a rough translation, you can think about it. Which I feel like that's just an extra degree of removal that if you can not have that, it'd be beneficial to not, you know? So in the sci-fi modern setting, you can use your swear words and talk with your slangs and use whatever kind of natural everyday language you would use as a real human in our modern society, and have it all sound like things that could actually be said by the characters inside the game, which is just a cool little neat bonus. So another game that I looked at, another Powered by the Apocalypse game that is supposed to be like for Cyberpunk specifically, is called Sprawl. And I think generally pretty positive things about it, but there is one big review comment critique that I've seen regarding it, specifically about how it sort of tries to incorporate this idea of like the character first and the cyberpunk genre. So there is this famous quote by Mike Pondsmith, the cyberpunk RPG creator, that goes, cyberpunk is not about saving the world, it's about saving yourself from the world. Which, that's a very cool and evocative statement, and it does sound very anarchy and cyberpunky. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, well, that's literally true of every single grim, sad, gritty, dark setting ever. So I feel like it helps you tonally, it helps you thematically, but I don't think it necessarily helps with how you should like structure your story, if that makes any sense. So for example, in Cyberpunk there's this like idea of life is cheap and it's very easy to die, and that like you are worthless compared to, you know, you're just a tiny little speck of dust in the cogs and the machines of the corporations and all that. That like people die all the time, which I get. And also, so in Sprawl, they try to take that idea that you can like die at any time, and that like you should know that you're like, you know, that you can be replaced at any time. And also that like the goal of the game is to escape, basically. You need to make enough money that you can move away and retire from the sprawl forever, is like the core main motivation and concept, and why you're going on jobs and everything. Which, cool and fits within the genre, but Powered by the Apocalypse and all these fiction first games are very much so focused on its character first. Characters do everything. Everything is about the characters and following them and what they're doing and how they are molding and changing the story, and you know why we're following them and everything. And so that's just in like direct conflict with the idea of life is cheap and you could die and like you don't get attached to your character, don't have any commitment to the characters we're following because they're just a stand-in and could just be replaced with anyone and they don't actually matter. And it kind of, a part of it also, at least the retirement aspect, kind of reminds me of like an anecdote by Brendan Lee Mulligan where he talks about this improv exercise that he does where he says like, okay, so what I want you to do is act out an emotion or a feeling and then like show this to us, and but really just like do this one emotion, this one feeling, and then crank it up to 11. Just do it as much as you possibly can. And then he would say that every once in a while he would have a problem where people would choose like boring or apathetic as their emotion or their feeling, which, as he put it, like the problem with that is you just might succeed. You just might actually be really boring and bore the audience, which is not the ultimate goal of what we're trying to accomplish here. Which ties me back to the sprawl and the idea of your motivation is to just drop all your responsibilities and move away. And like the problem with that is like you just might succeed. Like you just might drop all the responsibilities and get out of here. And then like where's your story after that? Like that's just the problem is the idea that there is just this arbitrary threshold that you've put on the game where like once you've completed this amount of missions and saved up this amount of money, your narrative is over. You know, your arc is over. It has nothing to do with you getting over this specific problem or you having this interesting thing happen. It's just like you've reached an arbitrary amount of money and now your narrative is over. Like the only time I think I've ever seen the character just retires and it was interesting, and like just as the end of their arc is like Picard at the end of TNG, where he doesn't even actually retire at the end of the series. He just finds out in the future that he is eventually going to retire, and he's also doing this whole timey-wimey court battle for the case of why all of humanity should be allowed to exist and to continue to live. And like he's going back and forth in time and he's talking to his retired self. So really it is like very little to do with him actually ending up retired, at least as his like character arc. And like and again, like if you do the whole like you can do the person goes out and thinks they're retired and then they actually come back for we need you for another job type of thing, because then they have like more of their arc. Or you can do it as like a bonus thing, like you could do like he's going on this one big last mission and then once he does this he'll make enough money to retire and then move away forever, which like that's cool. If you have the whole narrative leading up to this one big thing, that works. But to just attach a random money value from the beginning that you're just doing odd jobs to fill up until you can achieve it, that's like basically just like real life retirement, where you don't get to retire after you've defeated your second threshold guardian and return to the mundane world with your newfound boons. And no, you just work until you hit this limit where you're like, I think I can retire and live the rest of my life off of this, and then do that. Which real retirement, not particularly narratively satisfying. Yeah, so I guess the hope is that like you kind of just hope that you put all these arbitrary numbers in there and that things are just gonna line up to be like the term for like an emergent narrative, that like a story is going to emerge and come out of the idea that like you're gonna need this amount of money, and that like hopefully it lines up that you're gonna get that big job at the end, and then but I just feel like, just scratch all of that, just start off with the idea that the characters are the focus and they have a story, and that we're gonna like figure out what's going on with them. Okay. All right. So, an example I wanted to throw out there for how a check might possibly look in this game, as opposed to like D&D. If we're not getting down into nitty gritty and moving people around and rolling to hit and then dealing damage to them. Like for one, just enemies don't have stats. They might generally have like a vague threat amount that they are worth. Like they might either be, this might be like you might be taking desperate actions if you're fighting against these guys, or it might just be risky to fight against these guys, or it might be a controlled situation when you fight against these guys. But there's nothing like any hit point value or health or damage or anything tied to any of these guys. You basically would just say, okay, so there's the 3 goblin security guards across from us, or that are coming after us, so I'm going to pull out my SMG and spray at them. Then you're going to roll some dice, and if you achieve like a failure, or in this game, because it's cyberpunk themed, it's a glitch, or like the equivalent of like a botch or a failure, then you just totally spray and you either miss, or your gun jams, or they dodge, or they have armor and they soak up your bullets, and then you suffer a consequence from failing, and that consequence probably usually in combat is they shoot you back and then you get hit, and then now you are hurt to some extent, or you're like pinned down or something along those lines, or the most common result is you achieve like a mixed success or a partial success, where you shoot and spray and you accomplish what you're trying to do. You might hit 1 or 2 of them, but as the take from that partial success, that mixed successes, you also get a consequence. So you might also get hit, or you might also get pinned down, or whatever might happen to you from that. And then if you fully succeed, then you just hit 1 of them, and then they don't have any action against you. You don't suffer any consequence. But yeah, the idea is every single roll has stuff happen to it. You never, like in D&D, it's basically designed that like 50% of rolls just nothing happens, like you just fail, and it's like, okay, that's it. In this game, whenever you roll anything, something is going to happen as a result of your roll, which is just, I feel like that's a great just keep things moving forward, the fail forward idea of RPGs. And also, it also just kind of makes failing kind of fun, because now cool, exciting stuff is happening because you failed, instead of just like, well, I guess I failed that perception check and I have no idea what's going on. Okay, so another thing I wanted to touch on regarding how Shadowrun handles stuff is that I think they did a tiny, or they occasionally do a little problematic, a tiny little oopsie whoopsie, pull a little bit of an ableism here or there. They have this idea called essence, and essence is basically a measure of your soul. It's basically your humanity, and it is your ability to cast magic. It is like your ability for your will and your soul to manipulate and have an effect on the like maelstrom and connect to the magical world and all that, which cool. And the more cybernetics you have, the less essence you have, which, all right, that makes sense. Like, at least, you know, it makes sense balance wise that, like, the more, if you're a super magic wizard dude, then you can't do cybernetic robot stuff. And if you're a cyborg running around with robot arms, then you're not allowed to do magic stuff. But this accidentally raises a whole lot of implications. For one, so since this like will, this essence is tied to how much of a human you still are. Okay, I guess I should preface this by saying like this is a super common theme in cyberpunk. Is this ship of Theseus idea that you're like, at what point do you replace so much of yourself that you're no longer yourself? Which is cool, and I get where they're going with this. But since your essence is tied to like how much of a human you are, basically, there's this implication that if you have your leg get cut off and you replace it with a robot leg, well, that person is now, you know, it cost an essence for them to use that robot leg. Now that person is a little less of a human than a real person. But, you know, that kind of just like happens in real life. Is that sometimes, you know, people don't actually lose any amount of, I guess, you know, maybe physically you might lose some human meat that's a part of you, but like you're not actually becoming any less human because you have like a prosthetic. There's also this idea that like essence is everything that like you're putting into your body and that's having any influence on you that can affect how much of a human you are. So if you were like a drug addict, that might cost some points of essence, which you know, oopsies, you're accidentally saying that like people who suffer from the disease of like drug addiction are less humans than real humans, which I feel like was not their intention, but like accidentally became the implication. And so like they sort of tried doing workarounds and how solving this in the newer editions, where it's like, okay, like if you get your leg cut off and you replace it with a robot leg, you're still psychologically the same, so that actually doesn't have any effect on your essence. It's only if you put a chainsaw on your leg is that going to take away from your essence, because now your psychology isn't used to these newfound abilities that your cybernetics are allowing you to do, which that just also doesn't make any sense at all, because why does my soul care that I have a chainsaw on my leg? And like, why is my psychology the thing that determines what my soul is? Like, does that mean like crazy people are just like, or mentally ill people or whatever, like less humans than humans? And also, having a chainsaw on my leg is messing with my psychology, but like me casting spells and have a frog leg on myself, that's totally fine. Which, you know, it's getting a little confusing. There's also the idea of like you can hit your prosthetic threshold, like you know, I replaced my arms and legs with prosthetic arms and legs, and I replaced my heart with a I've got a pacer in it, or pace machine, or whatever that's called. And it's like, you've hit your prosthetic threshold. You've got more artificial parts than a human can handle. You have now gone crazy. Which, you know, I feel like there's people in real life that actually have multiple prosthetics and have managed to not go insane. Which, like, I get that the implication is that it's all neural stuff, the neural interfacing or whatever. But I think, at least as far as I'm aware, it still is true of like if you get a hip compartment installed, then you just literally have like a giant robo hole in your leg where you can just like keep a gun inside or something that like I wouldn't think needs to be like connected to your brain. I don't know, honestly. I haven't done a super deep dive into the essence, but I know and like the cyber psychosis, but I think it's generally got some flaws in it. Um, so I've just decided basically the more cyber stuff you have in your body, the more susceptible you are to getting hacked. Which I think is like kind of how it works, but I'm sort of just taking away that attachment of your ability to do magic to how many cyber augments you have. So you can just have like a bunch of cyborg augmentations and then also just still be a wizard. Okay. Another thing I wanted to touch on cyberpunks and shadowruns specifically, at least most of the editions have this idea of the hacker, and that the hacker just sits back in the base, back in a remote location, and they do their hacking thing when they need to, um, and are otherwise just generally entirely away from the party. Which I think cool in theory. I think that's a good idea, and it's unique to cyberpunk. Like that's not a thing you're gonna do in D&D. And it seems like a thing worth exploring, but I think in practice, at least from what I've heard, is it's very difficult to have this other element that just occasionally pops in to play the like hacking mini game of Shadowrun, and then just like disappears for a while. Which like again, everyone's got communication links, and the hacker can see through cameras, so they can like sort of kind of be there, but their stakes that they play with are just an entirely different game. Whereas like everyone else can sort of just get shot and hurt, usually, at least are their stakes. The hacker has this thing where like people can track their location and maybe find them and trace them or whatever. Um, and again, I think all this stuff is cool, but I think in practice, it's very hard to avoid this not just feel like two games that are being played at once, which is one of the giant things that I'm trying to steer away from and not have happen. So I'm gonna generally try to come up with reasons as for why the hacker needs to actually be hanging out with the party. Probably something to do with like receiving bonuses or like penalties if you don't have this. But like, take the data jack and like plug your brain into the computer and then do your hacking stuff. But I think like occasionally you can have the scene where the hacker's back in the car and just like remotely hacking and all that. Yeah, it's definitely something that I wanted to try to fix before it became a problem. So, okay, now that is all the notes that I had that I wanted to just touch on. I'm just going to do a good old quick tour of what exactly I've got so far in the document. So at the front, this is just the lore I've been working on so far. Generally, the idea is the great city of Veilguard has become Neo Veilguard after some disaster or attack, and all the clans have sort of restructured into these corporation clans, and everything has just devolved into this super oppressive libertarian nightmare type of deal. The humans have gone full religious, full like V for Vendetta. The elves are just like, making their super technology. The dragons are getting up to another civil war. And then there's like a very few people who are hanging around trying to pull some like freedom fighter terrorist, terrorist like stuff. And then I've started coming up with some generic gangs that have sort of evolved out of the different organizations and fantasy time. The archetypes are kind of the classes, except there's not going to be any actual class system. These are just sort of going to be like pre-built packages of abilities where if like you don't feel like coming up with your own full character, this is like primarily for like new players, I would say, who like don't really know how to make a character in an RPG. They can just sort of pick one of these and then like change things how they want, to fit their how they envision their character. Kind of like the Shadows in the Dark, Blades in the Dark playbooks, or the Powered by the Apocalypse playbooks, but I like a little more customizable than those. Okay, currency, new gold, species. There'll be human, orc, dwarf, elf, and I think probably halfling. I'm gonna go with. So your attributes. Now the core stats I stole from World of Darkness and the like D10 system, just because I wanted there to be a bit more nuance than the total of up to 4d6 or 5d6 that Blades in the Dark allows. So this now goes up to like 10d10, because I just think when it comes to the cybernetics and stuff, there's so many more things to possibly like give you bonuses and for things to affect. So I needed to pull out the range a little bit so I could play a little bit more with all the numbers. Just because, there's so many ways to affect your character with cybernetics and magic both being in there. Okay, so skills, generally a combination of like the World of Darkness and Shadowrun skills. Okay, aspects. Aspects is something I stole from Fate. Now, the main idea is you have these like 5 descriptive phrases that basically say something about your personality or your beliefs or your reputation or your background or whatever. And then when you act on those beliefs, or like when you act within the things that you'd be good at because of those beliefs, you get bonuses. So an example aspect might be like, I've got something to prove. And, just to be that, like, you've got a very bravado, like, kind of personality. But in the game, your personality actually affects the things that you do directly. Unlike in D&D, where it's just like, you might be a very brash kind of guy, but there's nothing ever saying that you ever need to be brash or act in any kind of brash manner or get any kind of like bonuses for being a brash person. It's just kind of a thing that you're sort of expected to act on. But now if you've got like, I've got something to prove. If you are in a fight with like, if we're in a fight where you're like outmatched or outnumbered, and your gang might be like, all right, it's not worth it, like don't fight this, like just get out of here, you might be like, well, I've got something to prove. You can invoke that aspect and you will actually get bonuses for this fight because you are acting within the trope of your character. And on the other hand, you can get compelled to act within your character. So if your aspect is like, I've got something to prove, you might be you might see like a group of enemies that you're like outmatched against, and then you as the player are probably like, I probably don't want to fight that. I, as the DM, can tell you as a player, like, all right, well, your character is being compelled to do this due to their aspect. If you choose to do this, if you agree, then you gain an edge. And edge is basically like kind of like D&D inspiration, a sort of meta currency that you can spend as a way to get an advantage, a bonus on a roll. So yeah, you can choose to accept being compelled to do that thing, or you can spend an edge to refuse that call and to like not be compelled. So yeah, I really, really like this idea of characters actually being incentivized to act within their personality traits, and also when they get into trouble and get into problems, it's not just because I, as the DM, decided something exciting needed to happen and just decided that goblins show up and start attacking you, but because of your personality, because the person you are now getting into this specific problem. So yeah, the idea of aspects from Fate, I absolutely love that idea. Okay, so Edge, I already talked about this. There's like the meta currency. It can be used for a whole bunch of things. Also, I really like the Blades in the Dark idea of flashbacks, that we don't spend time for an hour planning the heist, where there's never like everyone is planning out every single way anything could go wrong during the mission. We just start the mission, we just start doing stuff, and then whenever there was a thing that you were like, oh shoot, I wish I had planned for this, you can just spend an edge to have a flashback to show how you planned for this. Like you can have the like, oh yeah, well last night I came in here and then put a gun in the toilet in the bathroom, and so like, now I'm gonna go into the bathroom and grab that gun and then walk out and shoot this guy. You can do that kind of a thing, which absolutely love the idea of flashbacks, because the planning section of D&D has this tendency to have this real kind of like feels bad kind of moment where we've spent like an hour doing this big planning portion, and then we just start enacting the plan, and then within like 5 minutes something goes wrong, and that whole hour of planning we just spent just is thrown out the window. So yeah, I love the idea of flashbacks, because you still get that like sense as though the characters in this world actually planned all this stuff out, but we as the players don't have to sit there and do the paperwork. Okay, there's also this idea from Powered by the Apocalypse, the assess the situation, where you as a player can just straight up like ask a question, and then the answer to that question is told to you and it is like true. Which I really, really love this idea of, for one, as a DM, again, there's always that horrible aspect of always being too subtle and too vague and having your players miss out on content all the time. And on the yeah. So basically that, and like, so for example, if sometimes this will help you as the DM like get out that information, because the players can just start directly asking questions to like figure out what's going on, and then sometimes it'll just sort of be like an improv tool to prompt you as the DM to add something to the game that might not have been there before, sort of because the players just kind of think it would be interesting for this to be a thing, because they kind of just think that there's something else happening here, so they want to know what it is, and then it forces you as the DM to come up with what that is. Like, if I think things are slowing down a bit and I just want to pump some action back into the game, and so I have some thugs like show up and just, you know, be punks and try to rob you on the street, just because I think it would be cool to like have an action scene. And you know, you as the player might think like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why are there thugs attacking me? And then you might ask like, what's really going on here? Like, why would it make sense that these thugs are like, shouldn't, I would imagine these gutter punks, they only ever like pick on people who they know are easy targets. But like, I've got a big gun strapped to my back and I've got like this, you know, all these cyber augmentations. Like, why would they choose me? And then I, as the DM, have to go like, oh shoot, that's a good point, and then come up with like, oh yeah, well, you know, this isn't just a normal robbery. Then, you know, these guys, they would never just rob someone like you. Like, this must be like a hit. Like, someone must have paid these guys to do this. And then boom, you know, we've just added to the story. And so for why players would want to do this, when you ask a question and then when you act on that answer, when you find something out and then take an action because now you know this answer, you get a bonus to that next check. Okay, so performing actions. The White Wolf system, if you roll a bunch of d10s, things are either desperate, risky, or controlled. You can suffer, you know, the glitch is like the botch, that is like things go as terribly as possible. But otherwise, something happens, either a success, either a consequence, or both. Okay, yeah. Bad things happen to you when you suffer consequences. Resisting, sometimes you need to resist an effect. So, you know, if you were, like, if you did drink poison or something, or if you did, like, generally all harm and all damage is done through different like conditions that you receive. Like, there's no like hit points, you just sort of accrue different conditions until you die, of like becoming bruised and battered and cut and having broken limbs and stuff like that. And you can try to resist these effects by making checks, and if you do, then you lose edge instead. Okay, so gear, there's going to be a really big part that you have like an amount of load that you can carry into your character, which also ties into the flashbacks. Because like, if you have like a load of 9, or if you're like a super heavy guy, then you might not actually have like 9's loads worth of gear. You might only have your like pistol on you. But when you do flashbacks, you can give yourself like up to that amount of space you have unused worth of equipment. So like, you know, if you just carry like a giant duffel bag into this corporate office, like, you can just pull a flashback whenever you want and then sort of just tell me what's in that bag when it becomes apparent that you would need that thing. The downside to this, though, is that like, the more of a load you decide to go onto a mission with, you become way more conspicuous. Because like, if you're just a normal guy wearing a suit where you like might have a knife on you or something, you know, super light load, you can't like flashback and just give yourself equipment or whatever because you don't have anywhere to hide it. But you just look like a normal dude. Security isn't gonna like question you or whatever. But if you're walking around with 2 bags and a backpack and whatever, like, you're gonna be really suspicious and people are gonna stop you from going anywhere. So yeah, I really love that idea of that like give and take of like how the load and the equipment works. Okay, tons of slang. It's mostly just stealing it from Cyberpunk and Shadowrun, whichever one I like more for any given term. And that's about it. There's also going to be like a bit of a focus on downtime, because you're just gonna have to get. There's going to be a lot more interesting stuff to do. Where you're getting cybernetics involved and like, or downtime can sort of be like this is us planning for the heist or whatever, and like get bonuses to your flashbacks or whatever if you do that. It's cool stuff like that. So that's everything. Alrighty, chummers. I will see you next time.